Thanks everybody for being here with us today. We're thrilled to be doing this great panel here at DEF CON with the ICS Village. Thanks to Bryson Bort for inviting us to do this. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. We're thrilled again to be here to talking today about the topic, Your Infrastructure is Encrypted, Protecting Critical Infrastructure from Ransomware. We have a terrific panel of folks with us today, sort of going around the horn from my left to right. We've got Jen DeTrani, the General Counsel at NISOS, a managed intelligence company, helping enterprises identify adversaries and related threats. Jen has volunteered for every year at DEF CON for a number of years. She's been a federal prosecutor. She's run a solo law practice and worked at a top law firm practicing commercial law. When she's been at DEF CON, she's been teaching kids how to be white hat hackers through a nonprofit. And she's been a member of the executive leadership team at Sun Law, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping advance female in-house counsel. And she's a graduate of Dartmouth College of Michigan Law School. And she's grown up in the DC area, but she calls Southern California her home now. So Jen, thanks for being here with us. We also have Ernie Bio. Ernie is an investor with Forge Point Capital. He is previously served as the Chief Operating Officer for the Defense Innovation Unit at DoD, a government startup in the Silicon Valley. He's a board member of Huntress Labs and a board observer at Bishop Fox, now Secure and Bayshore Networks. He has an MBA from NYU's Stern School and a BS in Cellular and Molecular Biology from Loyola University. So we're thrilled to have you here, Ernie. He's an avid surfer, guitarist, and a music enthusiast too, so keep an eye out for that. And last but certainly not least, we have David Etue, good friend of mine. He's the Chief Executive Officer at NISOS. He's got 20 years of experience at early stage of mature companies. He previously served as the Global Head of Managed Security Services at Blue Voyant and the VP of Managed Services at Rapid7. He was the VP of BD at Gemalto, and led the cybersecurity practice at PRTM, which is now part of PwC. He's had a number of other awesome positions. He's also a certified information privacy professional, a certified CISO, and a graduate of GE's Information Management Leadership Program. So Dave, great to have you here with us also. So folks, we got a great panel and off we go to the races. So I'll start with you, Jen. So, we've heard a lot about ransomware in the last few weeks and months. We've seen the attack on the Colonial Pipeline. We've seen the attack on Kaseya. We've seen a variety of things, JBS, the meat packer. And we've seen the Biden administration do a number of big things, including 2 now executive orders in a row. Talk to us about what those executive orders do. You're a lawyer or maybe a recovering lawyer at some point. Talk to us about whether those executive orders are going to be effective at helping protect the nation from ransomware, and if they're not, what are they doing that's helpful, and what more needs to be done?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having me, and also thanks to ICS for having us. This is a great panel. So yeah, I think what's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of leaning into the situation from that level, and that is very, very different than what we've seen in the past. I know in the past we've looked at things in a task force manner. Here we're seeing DHS actually kind of pushing through in a manner of sprints. And these sprints are really meant to address issues that are topical. They're not going to kind of get to the bottom of every issue, but they're forcing the industry to look at things kind of in a cadence. Recently, we've seen the ransomware sprint that came out. That was April and May. But right now, I think we're in the industrial control systems sprint. And that is a very critical one, because as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline, it is very important that we protect the country against any sort of infrastructure being shut down. And that's where I think, this panel has some great topics ahead of it, because we're looking at how it's a public-private collaboration, I think, that is very novel in this approach. Yeah. As somebody who's kind of practiced in both areas, I think it's really heartening to see that sense of collaboration. It's always been there, right? I with law enforcement, there's kind of this sense of kind of poking around to see who's friendly. Now, I think what these executive orders are doing is basically saying, start talking, right? And so with this sense that zero trust is going to be the overarching theme of private and public sector, and with some definitive controls around trying to require 2-factor or multi-factor authentication, trying to segment out networks. There is a sense that we're both private and public sector are meant to get better with this approach, and it's kind of fun to watch.
Yeah. So David, you've been doing some of this stuff operationally, right? Back in the past in your time at Rapid7 and Blue Voyant. talk to us about some of these, some of the sort of the operational things we should be thinking about in the context of what's happened with Colonial Pipeline, what happened with JBS, what happened with Kaseya, right? And then these executive orders and sort of, Jen's obviously told us about the fact that we're looking, at least the government's going to move to zero trust. I think the planet is talking about moving to zero trust, right? Is that the answer? Is that the solution, right? Is it one of the pieces of it? Are we heading the right direction? And if so, great. And how can we do more? If not, what would you be doing from an operational perspective if you were running the show today?
Well, first, I think one of the challenges we have to step back and realize is that we've accrued 20 plus years of technical debt in time on the internet, and I haven't seen anything from the private sector or public sector that's going to pay down that debt overnight. And so I think the first acknowledgement is that we're working from a deprecated position. And I think what's been challenging with ransomware is I think we've always thought about critical infrastructure as from state-sponsored actors of what happened if there were a combination of cyber and kinetic action where a state actor wanted to disrupt our either as part of an overall kinetic war or for economic reasons disrupt our infrastructure. We didn't really think about the financially motivated actors and the components that come with that. So I think the difference between the state actors and the financially motivated actors is the financial motivated actors, a lot of the basic blocking and tackling stuff does start to make a difference. That does raise the bar. So segmentation, two-factor authentication. I do think there is some degree of hygiene that we either have to figure out how to motivate, and whether that's motivation through I think we too often fall to the regulatory stick of like, well, someone should get a rule that you must do these things. Perhaps there's other ways to drive the carrot to motivate folks, or one of the things we'll hopefully chat about later is I'm bullish that the insurance industry could have a role in helping us fix things here, because if you don't hit a base level of capability, if your stairs you're building aren't safe, you can't get insurance, and there's some point where that comes. So I do think on the operational side we have some basic block and tackling to get done, and whether that's not exposing not running 5-year-old versions of Microsoft Exchange that have been out of maintenance for 5 years, or two-factor authentication, network segmentation, some basic data security. I think those will go a long way, but I think we have to acknowledge that there's this tech debt is built up that we're not going to pay down overnight, and how do we motivate folks to do that and get the right solutions in place, or spend a lot of time running security operations centers serving small medium-sized clients, at least get them to a point where they can detect and respond in a faster period. And that's, again, given what's out there, that's not a simple solution overnight, but I think we've got some good things making progress on some of the recommendations.
So Ernie, it's crazy. Both Jen and David had talked about two-factor or multi-factor authentication as being sort of one of the things that's being pushed now. It's kind of crazy that we are in 2021 and we're still talking about multi-factor authentication. It strikes me as nutty, but you have a unique perspective, right? At ForgePoint Capital, and full disclosure, ForgePoint Capital is an investor in a company that I work for, IronNet Cybersecurity. But at ForgePoint Capital, you help run one of the largest or the largest cybersecurity specific fund in the world. Talk to us about you. So you're looking across all these potential investments. Talk to us about what the right plays are right now. Like what are the game changing plays that you all see in cybersecurity? What are the sort of the hot ideas out there? Zero trust is one that's obviously that we've already talked about briefly, that we mentioned. Tell us if there's some ideas that y'all are looking at in that space. Obviously IronNet does collective defense, right? That's an interesting idea. What are the hot ideas in your mind out as you look across the spectrum when it comes to grappling with this sort of ransomware? And a related question, given your experience at DIU and bringing that to bear at ForgePoint, is ransomware sort of a unique thing that we need to be focused on specifically, or is it just a component of this larger trend of malware coming from both nation state and non-nation state actors?
Yeah, no, great question. To answer your second question, it's just a continual evolution of malware, and from an investing standpoint, we kind of look at it from think of it as continuous attack surface testing, as well as extended XDR, extended defensive response, and we look at it from an investment standpoint, network. So how do we restrict lateral movement? So you mentioned RNet, but there's the network piece, there's the email protection piece, there's DLP, hopefully next gen DLP is what we're looking at, not the DLP that service 1% of the market. Threat intel on the endpoint side, obviously you have the EDR players, you have the CrowdStrikes out there. You also have smaller companies. You mentioned Huntress earlier. I'm on the board of Huntress. They do MDR for the SMB. The SMB has been a right target for ransomware because they have MSPs who are their IT service providers. They don't have the sophistication, the cyber talent, nor the budget. So how do we defend them? How do we leverage deception, privileged access management, and then moving left, app security testing. So everything from traditional SaaS to SCA to DAST, fuzzing, you name it. And then the other piece is identity. We've made a lot of investments in identity. And as I'm sure David and Jen can attest to, it's identity. There's a lot of debt there. There's a lot of legacy. So how do we, start thinking about monitoring entitlements? How do we manage identities cross multi-cloud? How do we potentially use passwordless authentication, identity proofing, and then obviously MFA should be table stakes. So that's kind of how we're looking. There's no silver bullet. It's this composite solution, which will hopefully get your cyber hygiene up.
Yeah. So Jen, one of the issues that's come up in this conversation is this issue of cyber hygiene, right? And the need to sort of get better at the basics, right? We've all talked about that for a long time, the need to just sort of get that bottom level protection up so that you're making the attackers work that much harder, right? And one of the ideas that David put on the table was this idea of insurance, right? That somehow insurance might be able to help us raise the bar on cybersecurity, right? A lot of people, in Washington, D.C., where I think at least a couple of us live, David, I know, lives down the street from me, in the Washington, D.C. metro area. In D.C., a lot of the talk is, regulate, right? Or as David put on the table, that we need some sort of government intervention, right? Or maybe, if we just pass enough laws or we get the FTC or the FCC involved, it'll solve everything, right? But this idea of insurance, I think, is interesting to me. Do you have a sense of how insurance might sort of come to bear on this problem? And in particular, can insurance help us get better at the cyber hygiene piece? And can it do more than that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, David and I don't have any skin in the game, but this is something we've observed over time. But I mean, just like getting good drivers out on the roads, right? Like there's a concept that you've got to have a vehicle that meets a certain standard and a driver that's at a certain competency. Like that is who you will insure to drive. Same with the insurance industry as it relates to companies, right? Like you've got people sitting on data that doesn't belong to them. And so how are they going to be the responsible stewards of that data, right? How are they going to ensure that these SMBs who have a hard time, scaling up, have the appropriate security measures in place? I think it's all about standardization and compliance. Those insurance companies can push requirements down on companies to get them compliant in a way that the government won't be able to, right? It's a matter of doing business. And so I think, we've seen some insurance companies who are kind of pushing towards that, but that standardization, I think, will come from that lateral movement into industries because they need insurance. No company is going to operate, without that. And so to get that, you're going to have to level up. And I think that leveling up is what a lot of us are here to talk about today, which is it's more than just, those few things. It's so many things. We can't even describe them all. But I mean, even like the cloud migration. I mean, we talk about, at NESOS, we talk about the fact that like if the CIA can get, everything up in the cloud,
right? And their classified stuff, right? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, they had a hard time. So I think it's just a matter of shifting the mindset around some of that stuff, and a lot of that is going to be kind of pushed down again. Maybe it's partially legislation, maybe it's partially from the folks who help businesses run, like insurance companies. But I think it's a team sport. Yeah.
So Ernie, from an investing perspective, sorry, David, do you have something to weigh in on?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. That was me, Jamil.
Oh yeah. No, so Ernie, so from an investing perspective, how do you see sort of the insurance marketplace and that driving cybersecurity? How do you see actually the venture investing space? Or one of the things I've always wondered about is how come venture investors aren't saying to their companies, hey, look, you need to protect your own assets. Literally all we're investing in is your IP. If that's not well defended, we're SOL, right? Help me understand sort of what's the right play here? Are there plays in the insurance space? Are there plays in the investing space? And if yes or no to those, do we need legislation? Do we need regulation? Like sit out there in Silicon Valley. I know the general view is, government can stay out there. That's great. And I think that's generally been how it's happened. But there is a push now for the government to get more involved in what's happening in the Valley. How do you see that? And what's your sense of it?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of cybersecurity MGAs, so managing general agents.
Okay.
You have the coalitions out there, at Bay, Resilience Insurance, and their models are all a little different. Some are approaching the S and the SMB, some are doing upper mid-market. But what they're all doing in different levels is doing security scans before they write a policy and during the course of the policy. Some are looking at, hey, how do we do DIFR on the back end? How do we keep the hygiene up? Because at the end of the day, in the cyber business, it's about your loss ratio. So if they could keep the loss ratio down, it's more advantageous to them. And then it becomes this kind of, OODA loop, if you will, with the customers. They're writing more premiums. The loss ratio is less. Cyber hygiene's going up, especially in the SMB. And everyone's happy theoretically. So I think that's a great first step. It's very early days in that industry, but there's a lot. I mean, look at the amount of funding that's going in. I think Ape just announced 185 million round yesterday or today. So it's as far as the government coming in, I think the government should get their own house in order first.
Right.
Quite frankly, and follow the executive order. Obviously, with Jen Easterly at CISA, and Neuberger in the White House, like there's some really A players, and at the end of the day, it's shared responsibility. So let's get our own houses in order and then share information, which I'm sure you've lived that that hardship, right? Because the government never wants to share. They'll take any information you give. It's hard for them to share.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the coalition and resilience and those models that the cyber insurers being more both more data driven and more and providing, frankly, in some ways light managed services on their clients' behalf. I think is really raises the bar, and I think it's not just in the fact that of the insured. I think what I'm hopeful for is that they have the ability to bring people who are not currently insurable into the market, which is a huge change in our in our base cyber hygiene, and so that finding ways to help people get insurable is a big deal.
Well, David, on that point, one of the things that governments have done when we're talking about car insurance and the like is they sort of require insurance companies to take on some amount of managed risk, right? Some amount of sort of the 18-year-old me driving around. Nobody wants to insure that guy, right? And so there are some earlier models for that. But I have a sort of related question for you. One of the things that Ernie mentioned was this idea of companies coming in and trying to figure out what the problems are before they go in, right? Whether it's with an investment, we've heard a lot about this in the M&A space, right? With insurers, right? Sort of assessing companies from the outside, sometimes from the inside, right? There are a lot of companies that have created businesses out of doing that type of assessment. I've always wondered how sort of capable those assessments are, right? Is it really realistic to be able to tell how vulnerable a company might be from the scans you do from the outside or the scans you do from the inside, right? And you've been at service providers that have come in both before and after the fact to try and figure out, what it looks like. Do you have a sense of whether, particularly from a critical infrastructure perspective, and from a vulnerability to ransomware, or frankly any type of malware, it's in a lot of ways ransomware is simply an example of that, right? Can you really tell that from the outside in or from the inside out? And if so, is it a good measure for insurance and M&A and diligence for investors?
Yeah, I mean, so first to say yes, and in full disclosure, that's a business that DSOS is in today. But
I didn't know that, by the way. So I did not know that. So.
But I tell you why it works. That's what the adversaries do. If you can take the perspective of the defender and dig in, but that's what the adversaries do, and it's working for them. So
in the sense
it works.
You said that they're testing from the outside to see who's vulnerable, And as a result, sort of that's what, if we do that, we can get a sense for it too. Is that your point?
Yeah. I mean, they're using Shodan. They're using, that they understand what's vulnerable. I think, the thing from a service perspective side, I think the thing where people get run into big challenges, and particularly when you talk about insurance or supply chain things, is that some of the, it's very hard to identify the true external footprint of an organization. And so, actually one of Ernie's companies, Bishop Fox, actually has a great offering here too. Is I think what everyone has the story of a supply chain scorecard that got some terrible score because it included their guest network or a franchise or those things. And so I think the challenge to it is doing it well. But I think again our adversaries are doing it well. It's like, hey, I'm looking for they're going, hey, I'm looking for things that have this known vulnerability that exists in this space for an organization that I think has the capability of paying this ransom, that is in a country that either doesn't have judicial reach to me or law enforcement action that would prevent this. And so they're clearly doing it. And I think we have to leverage that same intelligence capabilities ourselves. But I think the important thing is doing it responsibly. Doing it and giving someone a bad grade publicly is not. I don't think it's going to help us where we need to be.
Right. Fair enough. So no name and shame unless it's the Chinese or the Russians, not for our own companies.
And look, there's a point where you need to be a certain height to ride the internet, but over there we got to realize that no one's ever going to be perfect in this, and that we got to figure out how we motivate, not just penalize.
Fair enough. So Jen, one of the things that David just talked about was this idea of sort of supply chain vulnerability, right? And we've seen this has become a really hot topic. I mean, it's been a hot topic for a long time, but it's gotten really hot in light of this ransomware attacks, in part because people think about what happened with Solar Storm and the fact that was a supply chain vector, and now with Kaseya, that's a supply chain vector, right? People also concerned of the downstream effects of an attack on a thing like Colonial Pipeline, right? And that has sort of spillover effects. That's not quite a supply chain. That's not a supply chain attack, but it shows the sort of spillover effects. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've seen the vulnerabilities in America's supply chain are dependencies on certain foreign countries, including adversaries like China. So, Jen, help me understand, from a sort of what the government can do perspective, right? And what, or at least what legislation might do to help address these supply chain threats. One of the things that's talked about in the executive order, right, with respect to federal cybersecurity, is sharing of information between private sector actors, contractors who work for the government, right, requiring them to share information about incidents and potential incidents. We've now heard legislation up on the Hill moving where there's an effort to get people to disclose. It goes beyond data breaches, but disclose any incident you might have. Tell us how to think about that, and will disclosure of incidents sort of be enough to sort of address these supply chain threats, or is it a bigger problem that we've got to go further on? And is even incident disclosure a worthwhile thing to even get in the business of talking about?
I think just it's really, I think we'll find out when it plays out. But I think it's hard to say. I think it's disclosure. I think is a step in the right direction, right? It's that same sense of wanting to understand so you can measure, right? You can understand. If you can't evaluate it, then how can you respond to it appropriately, right? And so we need to create metrics across more than just our own organizations to understand what's going on. And I think there's a sense, whether it's ransomware, whether it's a supply chain issue, that when companies experience an event, right, they really don't want it to be a breach. They want it to stay an event and not move into that kind of sphere. We deploy all our resources to try to understand what to do in our company's own best interest. If there's a directive to share that outside of that, which I think a lot of companies, a lot of lawyers who are comfortable and have points of contact within federal agencies, like are already comfortable reaching out to try to pick around whether it makes sense to disclose something. But this that says you need to, you should, we want you to, and there's no sense of impending penalties, right? Like penalties come when you do something poorly. The penalties don't come when you show that you were vulnerable. Every company is vulnerable. There's no sense of like, we talk about zero trust, there's no 100% security. Like
Yeah.
that would be an amazing state to exist within, but no company exists within that state. So
Right.
I think that directive that says share, let us know is around that attempt to try to create metrics that allow for a valid response that can be coordinated
Yeah.
across more than just one company. And I
Yeah.
think that's very laudable. I think that is a step, for sure, a step in the right direction. Whether it's going to be effective and how quickly, that's very hard to say.
Yeah. No, it's a great point about sort of the need for information to get out there in the marketplace in order for us to coordinate responses. So Ernie, going to this question of responses, right? You served in the government, you served in the Department of Defense, you were in the military, you served at DIU, and now you've come out and you're in the investment space in cybersecurity. But one of the things that's been talked a lot about is that the government not only needs to get its own house in order on the defensive side, but it needs to do more potentially offensively, right? The government needs to respond more effectively to these types of attacks. You've seen now the Biden administration talk about the fact that, we're going to name the countries involved. We're going to start talking about holding countries like Russia, like China responsible for some of the things that happen in their space, even if they're not nation state actors, but if they're criminal gangs operating in their space and they know about it, we might hold them accountable. What is this the right road to go down? Do we want to be do we want to treat ransomware, as the FBI director said, like terrorism, which I think was code for if you harbor these guys, we're going to start treating you like you're responsible, right? Is that the right approach? And then second, do we need to get more offensive? I mean, do we need to be punching back more often? I like to use the analogy of sort of the bully on the playground, right? Where, we all tell our kids, go tell the teacher, and the teacher will tell the principal, and then we'll have a meeting and we'll solve the problem, right? But we also all really know that if in fact you want your kids to stop getting bullied on the playground, best thing to do is put them in a self-defense class, have them punch the bully in front of everybody, and the bully's gonna stop bothering them and nobody else is gonna bother them too. Now, nobody's saying tell your kids that, right? But it works. And so, should the government be punching back harder in cyberspace?
I mean, so this is a great question. And I think that on the classifying them as terrorists, I look at it with cyber, there's a Beano line. There's criminal activity and nation state activity that's directed at, data rich companies, whether it's pure ransomware, extortionware.
Right.
And then what we've seen recently with JBS, with Colonial Pipeline, now we have essential services that are being attacked. And it's one thing to, blow up a nuclear facility or something that extreme. It's another thing when you shut down the supply chain of oil and gas on the East Coast. And I think this might be a interesting analogy, but I was living in New Jersey when Hurricane Sandy hit.
Yep.
Lost power for almost 2 weeks, run up in gas prices, people fighting at Home Depot for generating. It caused chaos. And if you think of a cyber attack, it can have those physical effects those effects in the physical world. So to me, there's a clear distinction there. And are they, if you're harboring these cyber criminals, I think you should be held accountable for letting them operate with impunity. On the offensive side, yes, we should be more offensive. General Nakasone at the NSA, ever since he took over, he had the whole concept of defend forward.
Right.
And to me, that's, start punching a little more and going into other people's neighborhoods and showing them, hey, what's going on here. So I agree with that mentality. Now, what I don't know, being out of the government now, is what happens behind the scenes, all the clandestine stuff. But overtly, we should be punching back harder.
Yeah. So Dave, you've seen some of this stuff. You when you worked at Blue Voyant, you all defended some of the largest financial sector players in the business. Talk to us about how bad is the threat when it comes to critical infrastructure, right? You've seen a lot of it at Rapid7 too. So talk to us about how bad the threat looks, and is what Ernie says right? If the government starts punching back more, sort of we get more aggressive on General Nakasone's effort on defend forward, persistent engagement, right? We've got, as Ernie pointed out, we've got all these amazing people in cyber now. We've got Chris Inglis as National Cyber Director, Jen Easterly at DHS. We've got Ann Newberger at the White House. I mean, Rob Joyce is back at NSA on the defensive side. I mean, it is like a who's who of cyber defenders, and people, frankly, who are willing to go a little more up against the enemy and punch them, right? So from your perspective, having seen what the threat is of critical infrastructure, is this the right approach, or there have been a lot of people who said we shouldn't punch back because we live in a glass house, right? And if we punch too hard, they're going to hit us really hard, and we're more vulnerable and more likely to have problems than they are. Is that right? I mean, how do you think about this?
No, I'm not sure I'd say glass house, but I think while we are likely the most capable from an offense perspective, we also likely have the most to lose defensively, and I think that has to factor into our the policy of how we think about this. But see, if you talk about critical infrastructure, I mean, it's a fascinating term. So we're sitting here talking, in the ICS village, which is very focused on the industrial control side. I mean, DHS categorizes 16 categories of critical infrastructure. I mean, in some ways, everything is critical infrastructure in a lot of ways, and I exaggerate a little bit for the point, but I think the challenge of it is we often think, and particularly I think on the policy side, get wrapped up in the haves versus the have-nots. Is an investor-owned utility or a money center bank has amazing capabilities, but by nature of these industries we're talking about, they're all highly interconnected. Financial services, particularly, but is obviously highly interconnected. But I think folks on the like the energy industry, when you've lived and know well, is there's we have a handful of grids, and when one of them has an impact, and there are from major investor-owned, multi-billion-dollar organizations to very small rural co-ops, and I think what we often forget are the state of the have-nots, and I think Wendy Nather's great piece years ago of living below the security poverty line, and so there's organizations that have 10 people on IT on our power grid
or less.
And so I think that when we talk about things like information sharing and and public-private partnership, like those things are great when you can take the intelligence team from Exelon or from JPMC and have them talk to their peers when it's a small rural electrical co-op, it's a very different conversation. And as we've seen from, I'm blanking on the details of the attack, but as we saw, in one of the Russian attributed attacks on our power grid came in through a maintenance supplier in a small rural co-op. So I think that SMB conversation is one that's just so critical to our overall critical infrastructure security that we just that leaves us vulnerable in the punch back side. Again, it's like there's definitely places for punching back, and I'm all for it. I think I love that we've been more aggressive and recovered money and things over the past. So I think there's a lot of roles for that, and I think a lot of really impressive and creative collaboration in finding ways to legally take down infrastructure or take over infrastructure. So I think there's a lot more we could be doing, but I think we just have to keep our our state in mind as we do that.
Yeah. Well, so on that front, Jen, one of the things that we've seen the government do a lot of, is indict cyber criminals. You're a former federal prosecutor, or a former prosecutor. You have seen some of these cases go down. Is it really sensible to indict folks we know we're never going to get, right? We had these Chinese military officers, we have these Russian cyber criminals, some of whom are associated with the government, right? There's no chance, is there, that we're going to get these folks here. And so in a lot of ways, it feels like just a name and shame game when it comes to these indictments, right? Is there any value to these indictments? And if there is or there isn't, right? What about getting more aggressive? Are there any legal concerns we might have with doing the kind of things that Ernie's talking about, sort of, getting more aggressive, punching back, right? Or are there legal concerns with helping the smaller providers? Can we do something as a legal matter to help these smaller providers get the information they need? If they don't have small teams, can we push them the information or focus the information on them without having a problem where we're not helping these other folks? Right? Is there a problem when we treat people differently given how they're situated? So a number of questions there. Sorry about that. That was, I think, a three-parter.
Okay, I'm going to address them all together.
Awesome. That's
a great question. No, I think the word that comes to mind when I think about the prosecutions is like symbolism, right? Like it's a symbolic sort of shot. It's a long shot, right? The idea that these people will be held accountable, in a court of law in the United States is very far-fetched.
Yeah.
But is it meaningless? Probably not, right? Because I think there's a sense that even identifying, somebody who is hacking, whether it's SMBs or like, our nation itself is notable. Like that person has an identity behind a screen in a place that is very many time zones away, but still the idea of like literally like throwing down the gauntlet that this is the person who
we know it's you.
Yes, that is, I think there is something very gratifying about that. I don't think it'll go so far as being gratifying as far as putting them in one of our, jails. That would be amazing, but probably not. But I think, the question of what is an appropriate response and how do we properly defend, our country and our companies is multi-layered. I think a lot of the time, like we haven't even touched on like diplomacy, right? Like there's the idea of sanctions, the idea of like which country is this coming from, and will they be responsive to the diplomacy that kind of accompanies the sense that sanctions have the right repercussions for that country, and then can you lean on that country to then help you find justice against those individuals who were part of it. Now, in a lot of the countries that we're talking about today, those individual actors are not individual actors per se, right? Like we talk about having their own HR departments within criminal organizations. They're very organized. They're probably state sponsored, and that's just not a realistic outcome.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, last week, there was a bill, there's a bipartisan bill that's being introduced about allowing companies to hack back. And I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Yeah.
That was a 2017 initiative. It's been revived. And the question there is like, what would be the right proportionate action by a company? Like, how would a company say, all right, you did this, like, okay, now you get this.
Yeah.
Assuming that you could rise to that level of sophistication, like the question, and at the GC level, right? Like a lot of us are kind of questioning, like, do we want to be the individual who's saying, go for it? Yes. Like it's all systems go, like give it to them. Like that is, it feels very far-fetched, but that is a legitimate bill that is coming through. That bears some consideration, because if that's where we're at, we might as well put everything on the table and think through that, because there aren't many other options and remedies for companies.
Yeah. So Ernie, look, this has come up a number of times, right? This idea of private sector hack back, right? It dates back, right, as a military matter, back to the founding of our nation, right, where we actually used private ships to sort of form a navy for us and really defend our coastlines, right? Even though we had a nascent navy, right, we would often give these letters of marque and reprisal, as people refer to them. It's in the Constitution, right, and give these things to private individuals to go fight back on behalf of the nation. We obviously have today a cyber command. They have offensive capabilities. Even before cyber command existed, we had the Joint Functional Component Command for Network Warfare that did some more of the offensive stuff. But there is a lot of discussion about private sector companies being able to respond in some way, right? Some people talk about active defense as meaning, look, if somebody hits me, I can send sort of the way I would like a die pack in a package of money, right? It'll go explode in their network. I'll know it was them. It'll beacon back. It'll tell me it was them, right? Never mind that beaconing activity looks a lot like what malware does right at the outset, but okay, whatever, fine. So it'll beacon back to me, and maybe even it'll detonate and it'll destroy my data, right? But then what if it goes a little further, right, Ernie? Is this a place we should be going where, well, maybe it detonates and takes down their infrastructure, not their whole systems, but just the stuff they use to attack me, right? Is that a place we should be going? And should we be worried about if this is, as Jen points out, potentially, even though it looks like criminal activity, it might be state-sponsored activity, right? Is there a threat that we might have private sector companies get us into that so-called, land war in Asia? Do we have to worry about that?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one, because part of me says, yeah, you should be able to defend your organization, and you should be able to respond proportionally or maybe disproportionately. The other part of me, thinks with kinetic warfare, there's always collateral damage. And there could be fratricide. So, look at
NotPetya, right? NotPetya, an attack by the Russians against Ukrainians, $300 million per company, right? $10 billion worldwide.
Perfect example. I think as much as I'd like to see something like that, I think it would get too chaotic. You'd have the collateral damage. You'd have, it's not like when we had Stuxnet, there was an organization that could use 4 0 days and do it very accurately, right? That you can't expect, a mid-market, even an enterprise, a JP Morgan to do that. Right. So I think
I don't know. Jamie Dimon might disagree with you. He's got renewed, so
they might be the one exception. But when the financial institutions were attacked in 2012 by the Iranians,
right,
the government didn't help. My understanding is, and I know people that were involved, the government said no, and ultimately the call it enemy servers went dark. And
so weird.
It was the Israelis, right? They came in. So anyway, it's a slippery slope. I think we got to be very careful with that.
Yeah. So Jen, what about from a legal perspective? Let's say we did grant these letters of marque and reprisal to companies that that are being attacked, critical infrastructure companies only, and only really capable ones, right? Only the big ones and only the smart ones, right? Whatever. We pick them. We give this authority. We say you can only do these set of things, right? Do we want private sector businesses doing this sort of thing, right? Are there any legal concerns with that? And even if there aren't legal concerns, are there policy concerns about allowing private sector companies, even with all the legal authority in the world from the U.S. government, a little sheet of paper saying you're acting on our behalf? Do we want them in that business?
I mean, at the risk of alienating all of my friends who are general counsels, I would say probably not. I mean, general counsels are not cyber experts, by merit of having.
Except for you.
Well, I'm still working on it. That's why I've got to spend a lot of time around it. No, but I think I think that's the problem, right? I mean, general counsels the word general is in there for a reason. Like we are generals at the heart of it. If we're not, then it's very hard to execute against so many different things that affect a company. The question of like whether we want to be empowered to use force under a UN charter, probably not. It's probably the same question as like, should I be carrying a gun, even if I can get a gun permit? Probably not. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are legal ways through it, right? And there are corporate governance ways through it. You can create committees that can evaluate things, that can get down to like a very narrow issue and protect itself and understand that it's making a decision in the best interest of the entity, and then taking into account all of the other considerations, which would be, the country, the collateral damage, the repercussions, and do it in a coordinated way with government. Maybe if that, then possibly, but I would still, err on the side of what Ernie said, which is it's a big leap of faith, right? And it's a leap of faith that may not even be successful, even if you had the technical chops to execute it. What are you really going to get? Is it that sense of redemption, right? Akin to that DOJ style, like, we've now named him and
we've done something.
Yeah. How it's probably very gratifying, but is it ultimately empty?
Effective. Yeah. So David, it sounds like Ernie and general are like, look, we're not private companies doing this. It's not the greatest idea, right? So let's say that's right. Let's say we're not going to have private companies do this, and we're really going to take you and Ernie up on your suggestion that the government gets more aggressive and sort of does its part, right? Does the government know enough about what the private sector is being hit by to effectively respond to it and sort of deter behavior, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, the government's not willing to do it, right? Which they haven't been for a while. And now hopefully under General Axoni, they're getting more aggressive and they have more authority, right? So maybe they are willing to deter, maybe even capable of deterring, right? Do they know who to go after? Do they know how to go about it? Do they have the information they need to really sort of deter those who are coming up against our private sector? Or do they need, we've talked about information sharing, and that's all great and well, right? More data, fine, great, terrific, right? But a lot of it needs to be about collaborating in real time too, right? Working together consistently, day to day, day in, day out, holding hands as these things happen. Are we anywhere near that?
I mean, I think if we're talking hit back from a cyber attack, I think that's a much more complex conversation, and information sharing becomes a really challenging. I had a conversation few years ago with someone at a senior level at a state law enforcement agency, and they said, it's like talking to the FBI is like being a psychiatrist in the Chase Lounge is like they ask all the questions, you do all the talking, and it's a very one-way conversation. So I do think a two-way communication is critical. And by the way, just not only for accuracy, but also for things like collateral damage. You do this and you're going to take out the East Coast, like you're going to take out a pipeline, or you're going to take out so understanding the dependencies is challenging. But what I think we're missing in the hackback conversation, and part of why I love the naming names side is attribution is really important for two things. One is it can give you organizational insight as to who's doing it. So is this one person, or a small group of people who are financially motivated? Is it a broader network that's accomplishing other goals? How are they being financed? And when we know those things, we can all of a sudden take very different actions. It doesn't have to be just disable infrastructure. It can be stop their ability to move money.
Not just cyber.
Yeah, there's a lot of other things that we can do. I mean, I agree with Jen that the likelihood of these people ever showing up in a U.S. jail is low, but I just kind of grin and go, well, we just took a lot of places that they can't go on vacation and spend that money they're making, where extradition comes into play. So I do think there's a much broader set of actions that when we know the individuals, and then the entities they're part of behind it, that the U.S. government, has actions that can take, and that's a very different coordination problem. That that coordinating a cyber defense mission, a financial crimes mission, money laundering or OFAC like things like that. That's a very different degree of coordination that I'd actually love to see a difficult sprint around on the government side and sorting that out.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So, we're coming up on the end of our time together. And one of the things I wanted to sort of end on is a question about ransomware itself, right? Because the topic of our panel is critical infrastructure and ransomware. One of the things that got really interesting about the Colonial Pipeline hack, right, was that early on in the attack, Colonial Pipeline took their systems offline, right? They did some stuff, and then they came back up fairly quickly. Everyone was concerned about the potential for a major supply chain disruption of oil on the East Coast. There were even some people who were hoarding gas, crazily putting gas in plastic bags. By the way, for those of you out there, don't put gas in plastic bags. It doesn't work. It's a bad idea. Please don't do that. But there were these concerns, right? Legitimate concerns about a supply chain disruption, and Colonial Pipeline avoided it. Well, come to find out later on that they had paid the ransom. Right now, yes, the FBI went and they were able to get some of that back. That's a whole other question about how the FBI had the private key to the Bitcoin to get that ransom back. That I'll leave for the audience. But I have a question for each of our panelists, which is, should we be permitting companies to pay ransoms in order to get them back up and running faster? And if your answer is yes, or at least for critical infrastructure, a qualified yes, doesn't that incentivize the business? And if it does, how do we solve that problem? Aren't we sort of, quote unquote, negotiating with the terrorists? So I'll start with you, David, and I'll end with Jen, because she's the lawyer in the room and I want to get the lawyer's thoughts. But David, first to you.
So I would not, I'm not supportive of the government having a no ransom policy today. Is that folks, that people need to make a risk-based decision in their business. And I loathe the fact that it supports these actors and continues to helps propagate the problem. But I think that the government telling a private sector entity what they can or can't do with financially in a risk situation, taking I tried all parallels. We didn't go back and say you couldn't pay kidnapping ransoms. We dealt with that as a law enforcement problem, and so I think we're not quite ready for that. I do think there are a number of there are some things where some tools that while you say yes you can pay, I do think we're under leveraging the OFAC and money movement process. That there's a small and growing kind of school of thought that paying ransom should require some more knowledge and attribution of the entity to make sure that you're not funding, as a U.S. entity, you can't fund things that are SDNs. So I think there are ways that we can wield other things beyond the individual company's risk management decision.
But can I ask you about that? So I always hear this, right? Like, okay, we should make sure, as long as they're not paying terrorists or whatever. But look, they're paying cyber hackers, right? For all we know, these cyber hackers are funding. I mean, what are we supposed to ask them for ID before we pay them? Like, what? How's that going to work? I don't get that.
Obviously, there's ways. There are services out there that help with this. There are, and I think there's perhaps there's ways you can come to knowledge about the transaction that gets you to a comfort level. But we've had this SDN methodology, as a country for a long time, and it's while it's not perfect, it's been quite effective at taking out particular groups of actors, and I'd love to see it used more here.
And SDNs are specially designated nationals, right? People who are on sort of the terrorist list and the like, sanctions list. All right, Ernie, over to you. Should we allow companies to pay ransoms? And if so, what about this threat that it'll just incentivize the business more?
Yeah, so first, I don't think it should be binary. You either pay or you don't. In a recent study I read, only 8% of organizations got all their data back, and 29% got half, which blew my mind because I thought if you paid, you probably had like a 75% chance of getting it back. So today, I agree with David. It's like you're not going to tell, like, if your kid gets taken hostage, the government's not going to tell you don't pay the ransom. You want your child back. So I think
they might, but you're still going to pay the ransom.
It might, yeah. Right. But it's a risk-based decision. Is PII on the line? Or is it an essential service? Is it affecting national infrastructure? Is it affecting, something that could cause actual physical harm, harm in the physical world? So I think it's up to the businesses. I don't like it, but I think there's no binary answer to this.
Yeah. Can I just follow up on that though? So so let's say it sounds like you'd be more willing to accept payment of ransoms if critical infrastructure is involved. Did I hear that right?
That's it's good. You have to look at first, second, third, and order effects. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's right though, aren't we just telling the bad guys, hey, you know what you should really go after? You should go after critical infrastructure because that's where we're going to be willing to pay the biggest ransom. So hey, Colonial Pipeline, that was smart. Do more of that. You'll get paid more often.
Yeah, I would not write that down or suggest that. It's again, it's business risk with the business knowing what type of risk that ransomware and extortionware is going to affect on their customers and on the populace.
All right, Jen, you had the first word and you get the last word. Tell us what you think about ransomware, and should we be allowing companies to pay ransoms? And what about this incentive effect, right? If we tell them, like Ernie says, hey, look, the one place I'm willing to pay ransoms is critical infrastructure for sure. Well, doesn't that make critical infrastructure an even bigger an even bigger target than it already was?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both David and Ernie. So I'm going to kind of layer onto their sort of suggestions, but also kind of go farther, which is like, can we get to a point with public sector, with government agencies where because the thing that we're not talking about with that ransomware is that it's a very rapid response that's required. Yeah. So you're making a very quick decision. And as a company, everything that you do as an officer is in the company's best interest. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the overarching theme. Like, obviously the collateral effect is important, but if it's contraindicated by something legal, then that takes it off the table. I kind of query whether we could get through this, the Biden orders and the sense of collaboration to a point where companies feel like they can turn to law enforcement during a ransomware attack to say, this is happening, we're going to do this, we're letting you know, and maybe get some sense of assistance, even to try to get to that level of attribution. Yeah. Right? Like maybe that's where this all goes. Maybe you split it in the middle and try to get there, and that's kind of the best case for right now, because it is a very complicated issue. I think companies are in a really bad situation, especially, as Ernie said, when there's PII on the line. The government is not willing to indemnify you, right, from all those shareholder suits that are coming. So you've got to still make the best decision for your company. It's a very multi-layered question.
Right. Well, it looks to me like that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much to Ernie, David, Jen, thank you for being here. Thank you for contributing to this conversation. And thanks to Bryson Bort and the ICS Village for hosting us at this DEF CON panel talking about ransomware, critical infrastructure, and the potential impacts. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot.